Feverish kickball game. I don't know if you could call it a competitive kickball game, but it was a feverish kickball game, which I've lost again, and we all know how competitive I am. God's really tested me this summer. But maybe put this in a funny light. Chris and I were in Texas this week, and we were driving from Odessa, Texas to Austin, Texas, which is a nice little 5.5-hour drive through the nothing backbone of Texas. So we have this game we play when we drive. We call it the cow game. And the cow game is pretty simple. If you see a field with cows in it, you call out cows, which results in us screaming cows over and over. And if you're the first one to call it or notice it, you get a point. Once you have 2 cows every time you see a church, you get an extra cow. You marry your cows and get an extra cow. And when you see a graveyard, you get to kill the opponent's herd of cows. Person with the highest total at the end of the car ride wins. So you can imagine a 5-hour car ride to the backside of Texas. The score got high and it got competitive because Chris and I are both built like that. And so at one point, I have 31 cows and Carissa has 23 cows, and we're starting to go through a lot more smaller towns, and the nervousness is because you don't have cemeteries in the middle of nowhere, but you have cemeteries in towns. So we'd come up on a town and both of us would just be locked on. It got to the point where Carissa would see a church and slow down, believing there had to be a cemetery behind that church. The nervousness was so real, I was almost nauseous. And finally I saw those little grave tombstones speaking up over the hill, and I got it first, and it was 35-0. And then 5 minutes later, she saw a cemetery and killed all mine, so the game ended 0-0. But I saw the first cemetery, so I'm counting that as a quasi-win on that side. But it was competitive, it was intense, and it made up for the kickball lashing I took. So our reading this morning comes from the book of Hosea, and this is interesting how your Bible's organized over a Jewish Torah. You go through the big main prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then you get into the minor prophets. And Hosea is the first of the minor prophets in that string. I was reading a commentary this week that always mentioned that Hosea was the first in the minor prophets because it might have been the smallest, and so it was always the first so it would not get lost in the shuffle of the scrolls. But let that be what it is. So we are in chapter 11, and we will read verses 1 through 11. I'll read it from an NRSV translation that says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. And the more I called, the more they went away from me. And they kept sacrificing to false gods and offering incense to other idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. It was I who took them up in my arms, but they did not know that it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to feed them. And they shall return to the land of Egypt, and Assyria shall be their king, because they have refused to return to me. The sword rages in their cities. It consumes oracles and priests and devours them because of their own schemes. My people are hell-bent on turning away from me. To the Most High they call, but they do not raise them up at all. But how can I give up on you, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like the others? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm and tender. And I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am a God, and I am not a mortal. I am the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. And they shall go after the Lord, who will roar like a lion, and when he roars, his children shall come home trembling from the west. They shall come home like birds from Egypt, and the Lord will say, like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will return them to their homes, says the Lord. So over the past 2 weeks, we have taken seriously and listened to the words of God given to a cattle herder in the land of Judah. But we must realize that the voice and the words and the sayings of Amos were not the words of just one isolated prophet crying out from the desert. That we lean into the readings of another prophet this week, and we find that God had tried to speak many different times, many different ways, to many different people, to get God's people to come back home. And once again, we hear that refrain of God is speaking. The question is, can we hear it? And so today we hear from one of the other 12. We hear from the prophet Hosea. But Hosea speaks differently than Amos. Amos spoke directly and pointedly about injustices in the nation of Israel. And maybe at times you can get burnt out and uncomfortable on speaking on injustices, so we hear Hosea differently today. Hosea speaks to and about the dilution and the straying of Israel's religion. Hosea speaks about how the places of worship, the spaces of worship, and the services of worship within Israel had lost their way, had become diluted, had fallen into bad habits, or in maybe simple terms, had been infected by other religious practices in and throughout Canaan. Hosea speaks about the reality and the downfalls of idolatry. But Hosea makes it simple. Idolatry is basically anything that takes your focus off of God. Or idolatry in Hosea's sense would be anything that takes your focus off of God within God's house. God's house, those temples were meant to be holy spaces. Holy means to be set apart. It was a time and a space and a practice that you set apart in your life to be centered and focused on God. And idolatry could be anything that pulled your attention away from God in a set-apart space. And in that sense, idolatry could take many different forms. In that sense, idolatry might not be as overt and as blaringly apparent as we think it may be at times. Idolatry could be anything that takes our focus off of Yahweh. And we fall into these habits even within religion today at times. Throughout our story, our story of falling into idolatrous habits and not even meaning to. See, there's times where we know that our focus should be on God, our focus should be on the living water, and at times we can make idols of the things that point us to God best. And we can find ourselves worshiping wells and buckets and spoons and not worshiping and focused on the living water. We can get consumed and focused on the delivery system and in a way fall into the same idolatrous habits and losing focus on God that Hosea spoke to in that time. Or maybe idolatry is something a little simpler for Hosea. It's when you try to take anything something, whether that be a hobby or a habit or anything. Thing might be a good generic term. And you try to use that thing to fill the God-shaped hole in your life. Idolatry could be when you take something and you try to promote it into God's job description. And more often than not, when we try to use other things to fill God-shaped holes in our lives, or we try to use other things to be promoted into God's job description, we find those things tend to fall vastly short. They leave us wanting more. And in many ways, we find ourselves like the old Lay's potato chip ad or Pringles ad, I forget which one it is, that we bet you can't have just one. And you keep continuing to try to fill an unfillable gap. Idolatry is when you try to make gods out of things that aren't gods. When you try to ask things to do what only God can do in your life. And the results for searching for a God elsewhere in Hosea are relatively simple. The results mean that at times you might find yourself wandering back into Egypt. The result might be that when we promote or search for the isms of this world into the role of God, we will face a dangerous return to Egypt's and Holocausts. So that sounds like the scary work of Hosea. And maybe you might be sitting there right now saying, Sam, I've had enough of scary Hosea and scary Amos over the past 3 weeks, and trust me, I am there with you. And I was thankful to read the passage from Hosea this week, even though there were some tenuous phrases in there. But the real question in this passage of Hosea is how it describes who God is. And if you hear nothing else from our time together, from my time here with you, let it be this. That this thing we call theology, thoughts about the divine, thoughts about God, that it's not just my job. That it's not just something I do in libraries and really nerdy books that I choose to read in my free time. That theology is something we all do. The thoughts about God is something we all have. And that in times, in places, and spaces in your life, you have been asked or you will be asked who God is. Why do you choose to wake up early on Sunday morning when you could choose to sleep in? Why church? Why God? Who is this God? And usually when people ask that question, they're asking that question with a loaded gun barrel, because they already have opinions about who God is. And you're already facing 2 strikes in the count. Thoughts about God is what we're in the business of doing. And it's what Hosea was in the business of doing as he wrote the text of Hosea. Hosea attempts many different ways to describe God. Many different analogies and many different metaphors. But maybe the most consistent metaphor, and it might in many ways still be our most consistent metaphor in our language today for Hosea, for talking about God, is describing God as a caring parent. Now, as I say that, I hope that for the majority of us here, that is an analogy and a metaphor that works. And it's a healthy, positive connotation for descriptions of God. But at times we have to be understanding, and I'm understanding this morning that for whatever different reasons, that analogy and metaphor of God is heavily dependent upon what your earthly parents and standards have set forth for you. And if you live with and among people or have friends that have had rocky relationships with their parents, or have had less than relationships with their parents, describing God as a heavenly parent might be a really quick way for them to turn their ears off. But for Hosea, it was a useful metaphor. Listen to the language. It was I who taught them how to walk. It was I who took them up in my arms and cared for them when they were sick. I bent down and fed them. This is parenting language. This is God as a parent. And if the parent metaphor works for people, then we are doing good jobs as earthly parents and earthly authority figures of helping that metaphor make sense. But the other edge of that sword is there may be people in places, like I've said, that their earthly connotation and understanding of parents turns them off to hearing God as a caring parent. Because maybe in their world they've never associated the word caring and love and parent in the same sense. So this metaphor, this conversation, calls us as parents, as teachers, as coaches, as adult authority figures in many kids' lives to help this metaphor make sense in their life as it goes forward. Do you understand the significance that maybe theology just isn't asking or answering the question who God is, but it might be living a life so that people can better understand metaphors about who God is? This is an important message, I believe, to hear as school is about to start. And teachers get ready to spend arguably more time around kids than maybe their parents will over the next few months. As sports coaches and volunteers and special education aides tend to maybe spend more hours a day with kids than their parents will get a chance to spend time with them. And maybe the onus of helping the metaphor of God as a caring parental figure might fall more on the teachers and mentors and coaches and adults at sports games and events at schools and choir directors and dance teachers than it maybe falls on parents at times. So theology for us today is to help the metaphor of God as a loving parent make more sense, or hopefully make sense in the future. Hosea does a powerful thing here, describing what God did for Israel, probably before Israel could even remember it. What God did as a heavenly parent before Israel had those first memories. In many ways, Hosea kind of takes Israel down memory lane. Hosea opens up those baby books and shows a bunch of pictures to Hosea and to Israel that Israel had forgotten. Maybe Israel didn't even remember what their parents had done for them before they began to keep score. You ever had kids keep score? We had a kid earlier this week at football. And Doss comes up to our head coach, and he'd gotten in trouble at home, and the mom had called the head coach, and the head coach calls Doss over to talk to him about what had happened. And dusk, goes, man, Coach, like, moms be tripping. Coach Fitz looked at him and said, moms don't trip. Moms don't trip. The kid kind of hung his head, stared off, and he said, you know, you didn't say Mama was tripping when you were crapping your pants. You didn't say Mama was tripping then, when she was changing your diaper. There's a lot of things that Mama did for you before you ever said that she could trip. So you don't get to say she's tripping now. He said, moms don't trip. Don't ever come in this coaching office and tell me that mom's making a mistake. And in a way, that's kind of what Hosea does with Israel. Israel feels frustrated with God, feels like maybe they've been forgotten, or maybe God hasn't done best by them. And Hosea sits down and says, let's talk about all the things God did for you before you have any memories of it. See, it's a two-way street. Hosea realizes that understanding God as a parent and understanding who God is also along that street shows us who we are. That if we are reminded about what God did for us before we can remember, and we are reminded of God as a defined parent, then we understand that on the other side of that equation, we are beloved children of God. In many ways, Hosea says it generations before Paul would write it. But the fact still remains that Hosea says essentially that nothing can separate you from the love you have in God. You know the verse I'm talking about in Romans 8, nor height, nor depth, nor width, nor principalities. Nothing can in this world separate you from the love you have in Christ Jesus. Nothing can separate you from the love that God has for God's children. Even in hog pens, wayward children are still beloved children of God. And this is confusing because it is God's choice. It is God's call. And maybe that's what Isaiah meant when Isaiah said, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Is that God chose to love an undeserving people. Maybe that's what's most confusing about God, is that at times God has chosen to love an unlovable people. But the fact remains that God would and God could never turn his back on God's people. God's heart for his people is evident and is manifested in the reality that he can't give up on these rebellious, wild kids in Israel. Read the phrases there in early 11. I can't treat you like that. I can't make an example of you like that. I can't bring myself to punish you that hard. Maybe this is where we get that old adage phrase, this is going to hurt me a whole lot more than it's going to hurt you. But we see that God's compassion, God's intense emotion, God's love keeps God in relation with us. And that's a love that we can't really wrap our mind around. It's a love that doesn't make any sense to us. It's a love that we couldn't or wouldn't choose to do. But it's a love that when it happens leads to possibilities that limited love would have never allowed. A handful of years ago, we had a kid on a football team, Javante Payton, and Javante found every single excuse in the world to skip practice. Javante would tell the track coaches he was going to football, and he'd tell the football coaches he was going to track, and then he would go hang out with his girlfriend. And Javante might have been one of the most talented kids I've ever seen or experienced, but Javante was never around. And I was a rule follower then. I believed that you needed to show up to practices to get to do everything. And so one day, we're about to put pads on, and suddenly, for the first time that year, Javante walks in, ready to be given pads and play in the scrimmage that afternoon. And everything within my being wanted him to tell him where he could go shove those pads. And I watched the head coach say, "No, Sam, take him back there and get him pads and a helmet." I looked around at Coach Clayton and was like, he doesn't deserve to be here. He hasn't been to anything. We got 85 other kids that have been here. Why is he going to get given pads when everybody else has done the right thing? He said, "We'll talk about it after practice." Boy, was I mad. But I gave him pads, and we took him to that practice, and Javante did his thing, and I sat down later with Coach Clayton, and Coach Clayton said, "See, I believe that kid has no understanding of what right looks like. There's been no standard set. There's no father or mother in the picture to tell him, hey, you need to show up to things. You have to earn what's given to you in this world." And he said, "But if we don't give him a chance to show him what right looks like, he'll never know it. And the only way we can show him what right should be, what he should be doing, is to give him some second and third chances. We have to give him some things he's undeserving of to maybe, hopefully, give him a chance to understand what he has to do going forward." Javante last year became the #1 rated junior college wide receiver in the nation. He didn't have the grades to qualify out of high school, so he had to go to a junior college program and get a transcript that would qualify. And I'd have bet you every dollar in my pocket that wouldn't have worked out a year ago, but it did. And Javante signed a full-ride scholarship to Mississippi State University and will be their starting wide receiver here in 3 weeks. And I think that chance might never have happened if rule followers like me would have said, "You don't deserve jerseys and pads." Because sometimes you have to give some people some chances they don't deserve. Sometimes that's what God did with Israel. Sometimes the only reason Israel survived is because God's compassion didn't make any sense to the way humans would do it. God's choice to love went beyond humans' choices to love. Maybe that's what actual love is. Maybe that's what actual divine love is. God's compassion was the inability to sentence the child to death. Even though that Deuteronomy 21 said that rebellious, wayward kids could be sentenced to death. The law was there. It was possible. But God couldn't bring himself to do it. Compassion came to the rescue. A gut reaction deep within the soul of God. And suddenly voices raised in anger and argument turned to voices that were calling the kids home. God will not give up on God's people. And maybe the best answer to the question of who God is that God is a parent who waits at the end of the driveway for the kids to come home. The story in Hosea is that God's heart is overturned because compassion ultimately wins. That sin and rebellion don't have the last word as long as God is involved. That nothing can destroy or frustrate the plan that God has to love God's people. So may we live into the love that our heavenly parent, heavenly teacher, or heavenly coach has for us. May we show and practice this compassion to a world that doesn't understand what that means at times. May we be a loved people who in turn love people. Or as the hymn would say it, we love because he first loved us. So as we close today and our altar is open for prayer, maybe the prayers this morning are to find God's love deeper in your life. Maybe you struggle with what it means to know that God loves you. Maybe they're prayers for ways to see that love easier. Maybe they're prayers for ways to live that love into existence and be a living metaphor and analogy for the prophets when they talk about God as a caring parent. Or early in Hosea, maybe those are prayers for how to be a more loving spouse, partner, husband, or wife. Or maybe they're prayers on the other side of the equation for how do we be a more loving, less rebellious, less selfish, more graciously remembering child, son, or daughter, not only to our heavenly parent, but to our earthly parents as well. Amen.
Amen.
So may we be reminded that God is the perfect heavenly parent, and live a life that mirrors and echoes the compassionate example already set by God, even before we could remember. Amen.
Amen.
So this afternoon, I believe is it 2 o'clock? 2. We have prayer for the upcoming school year, and that is typically at the high school, if I'm correct, right? Schools and rhythms of school lives are a big part of what we do here, so to pray for a seamless transition and a fruitful year on that side, all are invited there, and to keep your ears open for end of summer celebrations and beginnings of fall programmings in the days to come. Let's rock and roll into Sunday school, I guess.